Last I can see the purpose of my life, Bartleby, and I'm content.
In Herman Melville's short story, Bartleby, we meet a clerk who one day refuses to do any new tasks. He says repeatedly, "I would prefer not to."
My mission in this world, Bartleby, is to provide you with office space for as long as you may choose to remain.
Fiction has the luxury to play with reality.
Dasha Kipper, a clinical psychologist, says the hapless narrator and his desperate and futile efforts remind her of caregiving for patients with dementia.
Instinctually, viscerally, I always thought, my mind would always flash on some of the literature that I read, that I think that really captured the absurdity and the banality of being a caregiver.
Kipper says caregivers are navigating these impossible worlds where they can't count on memory, logic, or continuity. She writes about that in her book, Travelers to Unimaginable Lands, Stories of Dementia, the Caregiver, and the Human Brain.
It's almost like a philosophical thought experiment, because everything that the human mind needs that make it possible for us to sustain human relationships is now slowly being taken away by this disease.
And she's seen how this plays out. When Kipper was 25, she moved in to care for a 98-year-old Holocaust survivor in the first stages of Alzheimer's disease.
What really struck me as I was taking care of him was how much my own brain was kind of unraveling.
Kipper also watched how the man's son would have the same argument with his dad over and over.
I would see his son going into the, anger, argument, guilt, anger, argument, guilt.
Even knowing about his father's disease, the son would return to the familiar routine and the same family dynamics. In Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, the family also falls back to their usual ways in spite of the main character Gregor's pretty dramatic transformation.
Gregor Samsa awoke one morning to discover that he had been transformed into a giant cockroach.
On the one hand, everything changed when their son transformed into a bug, and on the other hand, absolutely nothing changed. And I found that to be so emblematic of families with dementia.
In another example from Kipper's book, a husband begins to think that at certain moments his wife Elizabeth is no longer his wife, but an intruder.
She would say, "No, I'm your wife." She'd give him all this evidence, and he would throw her out of the house. He'd become very hostile and defensive. And Elizabeth was really ashamed later on to say how long it took her to stop arguing.
Even when caregivers stop arguing against impossible worlds, they can still feel irrational emotions. Kipper points to another example where a husband sees his wife having conversations with book jackets, sharing her childhood in Vienna with Marcel Proust. He would be envious of Thomas Mann.
He was very protective of his wife's inner world. And when he would ask about her world, to try to be included in it, and he did this gently, she would get very angry with him, like he was intruding and he should really mind his own business.
We're biological creatures with social needs that are hard to push aside. Kipper says we expect caregivers to feel sadness, but we rarely acknowledge or see how their own brains are being tormented in the process too.
This disease demands so much of our brain that I really believe we're not always capable of. The barriers are so big, and those barriers are not just logistic, they're also neurological.
Dasha Kipper says it's a mistake to look at the disease in a vacuum, where one brain has deficits and the other is perfectly healthy, reasonable, and capable. When one person lives in an impossible world, the people close by dip into it too. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Holly J. McDede.